Here to welcome everyone here today for the Leadership Roundtable discussion with the Women in Public Policy Center for Public Leadership visiting scholar, Deborah Rhode. We're very pleased to co-sponsor this discussion and have a chance to bring Professor Rhode's important work to Harvard. One of Professor Rhode's particular fields of expertise is women in leadership. I don't think you'll be talking on that today.
No. Well, later.
Later, yes. So she's been kind enough to talk with students this afternoon on the difference makes. When I gave a brown bag last year on women in leadership, I leaned very heavily on your work as well as on the critical mass of scholars we've got here at the Kennedy School. I think that we might, person for person, have more people studying women in leadership than any other university on the planet. And so it's
Slow
great to
race, but but you're winning.
Right. So we're particularly delighted to have you here. And I'll now turn the floor over to my colleague, Barbara Kellerman, Lecturer in Public Policy and Research Director of the Center for Public Leadership.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome to everybody. I think the room is small enough. Deborah had requested that we do this, that if we could just go around and very briefly introduce ourselves, and then I'll say a few more words about Deborah. I'm Barbara Kellerman, as Jenny just mentioned.
I'm Deborah.
Jane Mansbridge.
Dorothy Zimberg.
Andy MacFarland from the Law School.
Pete Zimmerman.
David School. Yeah, please. David Gardner.
John Thomas, Kennedy School.
Lena Gvozdeva, former CPL fellow last year from Russia.
Josh Good.
With where, though?
Graduate of the Divinity School and sitting in as a part-time CPL secretary.
Linda Peak-Shack, I'm a CPL fellow.
Marie Danziger, Kennedy School.
I'm Scott Snook, I'm at the Business School.
Jeff Keogh, I'm an editor at Harvard Business School Press.
Lauren Nash, I'm at Harvard Business School.
Carol Chetkovich, Kennedy School.
Ken Winston, Kennedy School.
Hannah Riley Bowles, Kennedy School.
Scott Webster, Kennedy School.
Bob Roper, Kennedy School. Apologies, I have to leave at 1 to chair another meeting.
Thanks for coming.
Dennis Thompson, Kennedy School, and various other places.
We're sending him across the river tomorrow for good.
Sarah Chase, Kennedy School. Robin Ely, formerly Kennedy School, now at Business School.
We lost you. Deborah's startlingly prolific and impressive biography is in front of you, so I do not need to, nor will I, review it or recite it. I just want to express a personal note to and about Deborah. She is a rare colleague, generous in spirit as much as she is gifted in her craft. She's been connected a bit to the Kennedy School in the past. She's connected to the Kennedy School in the present. And it is my hope that she will remain connected to the Kennedy School in the future. So it is not only a personal pleasure, but really a professional one, and in every aspect gives me a sense of pride as well as pleasure to introduce Deborah Rhode.
Well, and thank you for hosting this. I met Barbara when I was chair of the Commission on Women in the Profession, and we coordinated a conference together on women in leadership here, and the essays from that conference turned into a book which is dedicated to Barbara. And I said in the acknowledgement that she really exemplified all that was best about women leaders, and I meant it then and mean it more with each time we have to spend with each other. So that having been said, I'm always happy to come to Harvard, where I visited for a year, where I have many friends, some in the room. And it's a particular pleasure to talk about ethics and leadership at this historical moment. I'm thinking about doing a book on this subject as somebody whose main field has always been professional ethics, and this is, after all, a very good moment for moralists. Integrity is in fashion, and those of us who worry about ethics for a living have an unusually attentive audience. And the reason, of course, is that money talks, and often in circles where morals don't. And recent events have, of course, brought home the connection between the two. According to the No More Enrons Coalition, the latest corporate scandals have cost Americans upward in $200 billion in lost jobs, taxes, investments, and pensions. Others put the value as high as $5 trillion. Trust in business and professional ethics, which has never been all that high to begin with, has fallen to new lows, and lawyers, whose ranking for honesty has just barely edged out used car salesmen in opinion polls, are now joined by corporate executives and accountants. Better company, all things considered. So as the confidence in market structures erodes, national leaders have all been clamoring that something must be done and have called upon business and professional schools to do their bit. Our president has insisted that these schools must be, as he put it, principled teachers of right and wrong and not surrender to moral confusion and relativism. Other leaders, both within and outside the academy, have demanded that professional schools not only teach integrity, but screen for it as well. So you have a lot of prominent schools, including Harvard, which have put new questions on their MBA application forms. Some are even beginning to read the responses. Courses, committees, conferences, commissions have all been assembled, dutiful platitudes have been uttered, and parodies of all the above are in ample supply. I think my favorite one ran in the New Yorker this past summer under the caption, Bush, Cheney, Blister, Shady Business Ethics. For anyone who missed the column, this is where Bruce McCall explained that the president displayed his customary can-do attitude in solving the real problems facing American business, such as overcharging employees for lunch in the company cafeteria and theft of hotel shampoo, soap, and sewing kits by corporate executives traveling at company expense. To combat these abuses, the president reportedly announced plans to form a cabinet-level Department of Homeland Personal Toiletries and a blue ribbon panel of corporate food managers who've been asked to report back to him by 2050 if they have any thoughts. Well, occasions like that, this really offers some opportunity to take stock of critics and their critics of the current state of professional ethics. And if we begin with the widely shared premise that the answer is more integrity, then I want to suggest the real issue is what is the question? What are the strategies that are most likely to promote higher ethical standards, and what role can professional schools play in the process? And to that end, it seems to me appropriate to focus first on what we mean by integrity, and then on the capacity of postgraduate programs to identify it in applicants and inculcate it in students. And given the limited ability of professional schools to do either, I'll then say a couple of words about the structural influences of unethical conduct and the necessity to better address them by scholars and teachers. And in essence, my claim is that much of the current demand for action by business and professional schools is misdirected. Postgraduate education is not a good place to teach right and wrong in the president's terms, or to screen out applicants who are unable to make the distinction. But I do think that schools could and should do much more to give students the foundations for ethical analysis and understanding of the structural pressures that undermine ethical commitments, and the strategies, both personal and organizational, that could reduce those pressures. And I think faculties of business and professional schools could also direct more of their research and policy work to institutional reform, and I hope we have some time in questions to talk about the forms that might take. If there's a moral to the current stories of corporate misconduct, it's not simply or solely one about integrity. Obviously, greed and dishonesty are part of the narrative, but so are problems of institutional design. Organizational reward structures and regulatory frameworks are just not, in too many instances, well constructed to reinforce ethical conduct. And unless and until we address those institutional problems, to present integrity as the answer is going to misconceive the central questions. The most productive inquiries I want to suggest for business and professional schools are not how to keep out the morally myopic or construct an ethics curriculum that will convert them. Their real challenge is to equip the great majority of business and professional students to recognize and deal responsibly with the ethical conditions and conflicts that they'll inevitably confront, and to design regulatory structures that will be part of the solution, not the problem. I think Anna Arendt's comments in Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she described the banality of evil, resonate in many ways with our current experience. Eichmann, she noted, like other leaders of the Third Reich, did not consciously embark on a plan of unprecedented moral atrocity. Rather, as she put it, except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. Many of the professionals implicated in America's recent moral meltdowns fit a similar description. And the challenge for professional schools is to help individuals and institutions cope with the pressures that pit moral principles against personal advancement. Well, that having been the wind-up, let me say a few words about what we mean by integrity and the limited capacities of schools to screen for it and inculcate it. Certainly in common usage, it's a kind of all-purpose term for moral approval, but in philosophical discussions, it usually connotes a more specific set of qualities that make for an integrated self. At a minimum, persons of integrity are individuals whose practices are consistent with their principles, even in the face of countervailing pressures. But usually we mean something more than moral steadfastness, since fanatics, after all, may be loyal to their values, but we don't praise them for integrity. What earns our praise is a willingness to adhere to values that reflect some reasoned deliberation based on coherent assessment of relevant evidence and competing views. And some theorists would also demand that the values themselves satisfy certain minimum demands of consistency, generalizability, and respect for others. Now, few would dispute the importance of integrity among those preparing for business or professional careers, and the recent spate of corporate scandals has prompted greater efforts to identify that quality in applicants. So, some MBA programs have intensified their scrutiny of information that applicants provide by verifying, for example, the accuracy of grades, prior experience, and recommendations. And other institutions have requested more information related to integrity, both from applicants and those who recommend them. For example, Harvard now asks for letters of recommendation to rank candidates' integrity on a 5-point scale. And they're also asking applicants to discuss an ethical dilemma that you've experienced firsthand. How did you manage and resolve the situation? In explaining these new additions to the application process, Harvard's director of MBA admissions noted, "It's really important, and certainly recent events have brought that to light, to do our best thoroughly and to the best of our ability, understand a candidate's values and ethics." The director of Chicago's MBA program put the point more bluntly, "We're more than willing to reject evil nerds." But whether the means chosen to the task are adequate is another matter, and one that too few institutions are asking, at least publicly. Requesting applicants to describe a personal dilemma is perhaps a modest improvement over the once common practice of asking bar applicants to explain what the code of the ethics means to me. But the assumption that this kind of autobiographical revelation is going to reveal much about a candidate's integrity seems dubious at best. And given the highly competitive nature of the admission process, it's unlikely that most candidates are going to reveal this as an opportunity to bare their moral souls. Indeed, if experience with personal essay questions on college application forms is any guide, we can soon expect the rise of a new market in moral dilemmas. Those ethically challenged will be able to purchase advice manuals, essay coaching, probably in fact a few prepackaged narratives suitable for adaptation to personal circumstances. And here I think the prospect is reminiscent of a New Yorker cartoon picturing two high school students watching a classmate escort a little old lady across the street, and the caption reads, "Well, there's Sarah padding her college resume." So I think perhaps information about applicants' character that comes from letters of reference and background checks might be somewhat more productive, but again, their predictive capacity is limited. Presumably, few applicants are going to solicit recommendations from individuals likely to disclose a moral blemish. And if candor creeps into the process, it may be more reflective of applicants' poor judgment in selecting references than their integrity relative to other applicants. Submission of false resume information may be more common, but somewhat less probative of moral unfitness than is commonly supposed. One consultant for the Society of Resource Management noted that lying in employment-related application forms is happening on a very large scale. They did one recent survey of 2.6 million job applications and found that half revealed some dishonesty. And other research on student cheating finds even higher levels of misconduct. Fudging the facts occurs with some frequency, even at the highest corporate levels, and a representative review of resumes submitted for president, vice president, and board of director positions found that about a quarter included some misrepresentation. I'd love to see a comparable survey, say, in ethics professionals or, academics applying for positions in leadership. Worse still, when the resume fraud is exposed, too many businesses treat it as business as usual. A recent case in point, some of you may recall, was the Bausch & Lomb CEO who was disclosed to have claimed he earned an MBA from NYU. When the inaccuracy of that came to light, the company's board of directors initially called it an unfortunate mistake. Then, in the wake of adverse publicity, elevated it to a serious matter, and finally, forced by public pressure, yanked his $1 million bonus, but he's still there. And in this cultural climate, some students may well think that a bit of resume refurbishment is a venial sin. Of course, business and professional schools have an obvious interest in trying to dispel that attitude by excluding applicants who distort their records. But it doesn't entirely follow that even when you catch it, the exclusions are a reliable way of screening out those likely to engage in future misconduct. We know, in fact, that misconduct is highly situational, and while individuals differ in their responses to temptation, contextual pressures have a substantial impact on ethical conduct. How applicants will cope with moral dilemmas in their later careers depends really quite heavily on factors that are hard to anticipate at the time of admission, such as financial circumstances, peer pressure, and organizational reward structure. I don't want to suggest that screening efforts should be abandoned, since however limited their effectiveness in revealing an applicant's true values and capacity to live up with them, they at least send a useful message about what the institution values and its willingness to institutionalize those values. But I think that message also needs to be conveyed through the entire curricula, and in that effort, most schools fall far short. So let me say a word about the problems with ethics instruction in their relationship to current scandals. On the surface, ethical instruction as a response has much to recommend itself. William Hazlitt once wryly observed that we can conveniently applaud what is right and condemn what is wrong when it costs us nothing but the sentiment. And compared with other structural responses to corporate misconduct, curricular refurbishment is a pretty cheap fix. It was, therefore, as Andy Kaufman will remember, when Watergate investigations pushed lawyers' public opinion rankings to new lows, the American Bar Association first called upon law schools to institute mandatory ethics instruction in law schools. And it was Watergate, coupled with a series of corporate scandals in the late 70s and 80s, that also encouraged greater ethics coverage in business schools. And recent events have now prompted demands that the subject should actually be taken seriously. And even students have joined the chorus. In one survey, over 80% of prospective graduate students felt that MBA programs should be retooled to include greater emphasis on ethics. Now, for those of us who teach in this field, it's a cheery development. certainly the current state of ethics instruction leaves a lot to be desired, and in most institutions in law it's relegated to a single required course that ranks pretty low on the academic pecking order. Many of the courses, present company accepted, focus primarily and uncritically on the ethical rules and constitute the kind of functional equivalent of legal ethics without the ethics, and leave future practitioners really without the foundations for reflective judgment. And although ethics issues arise in every subject, that certainly wouldn't be apparent from the core curriculum or from the leading case books. I once did a survey of those from the main law review publishers and found that if you look at the standard case books across a curriculum, they devote less than 2% of their total coverage to issues that might conceivably raise ethics questions, and most of that coverage was just reprinting a relevant rule. That kind of marginalized treatment of this subject really subverts the message that's intended to be conveyed. Specialized ethics courses need to be supplemented throughout the curricula, and students learn from subtext as well as text, and silence is a very powerful socializing tool. I think that the rationale for a more systematic approach to the issue is quite strong, but not for the reasons that President Bush and other commentators have suggested. The basic responsibility for teaching right and wrong comes in business schools or law schools much too late. A few hours of classroom conversation is not likely to alter the fundamental values that individuals have acquired over a lifetime from families, relatives, schools, peers, and the culture generally. But while the contributions of ethics instruction at the professional level shouldn't be overstated, they shouldn't entirely be undervalued. They're not simply, as one critic put it, an exercise in compulsory chapel. Most research indicates that strategies for dealing with basic ethical issues change significantly during early adulthood, and that well-designed courses can improve individuals' capacities for moral reasoning. They give people a better understanding of concrete professional dilemmas, as well as the analytic strategies and the practical approaches that assist in solutions. Wharton's business school and ethics professor Thomas Donaldson once noted that people are fond of saying that you learn ethics at your mom's knee, but my mother didn't teach me about highly leveraged derivative transactions. And of course, a lot of the competing issues of client loyalty and social responsibilities that lawyers confront are not matters that they will have considered before law school. And there's some value in having students confront the trade-offs before they have a vested interest in the resolution. Also, well-designed courses can explore the structural conditions underlying moral dilemmas and appropriate regulatory responses. And while this isn't the occasion for a full discussion of those structural influences, let me just close with a couple of thoughts about how important it is to remind us about how even the really good go bad if the pressures are substantial. The most famous, of course, textbook example is that of the Stanley Milgram obedience studies. When asked to administer electric shocks in an experiment, 2/3 of the subjects fully complied up to levels marked dangerous on the scale that the subjects saw, despite the screams of pain that the simulated other subjects made. Yet, when the experiment was described to another group of subjects, individuals predicted that at most 1 person in 1,000 would fully comply, and no one believed that they personally would do it. Subsequent studies have similarly demonstrated how market forces and organizational pressures really can erode personal values and professional responsibility. When faced with a misalignment of ethical principles, peer pressures, and workplace incentives, many individuals develop strategies of moral disengagement that really assist them in rationalizing the misconduct. Strategies are probably common to everyone in this room: euphemistic labeling, displacement or diffusion of responsibility, reattribution of blame, often permit lawyers and corporate managers to deny accountability for unethical actions. Those strategies are apparent not just in the massive moral meltdowns that have recently been on display, but also in everyday deceptions of fairly petty proportions. And over time, that kind of dissembling breeds a climate that corrupts judgment and lays the foundations for more serious misconduct. Fudging on billing reports, willful blindness to collegial fraud, strategic withholding of material facts are all predictable responses to an institutional structure of the kind that is really quite pervasive in many workplaces. Virtue, Mark Twain once observed, has never been as respectable as money. And where short-term profits and personal salaries are the key determinants of power and status, integrity is going to lag behind. Now, we're not going to solve those problems in business and professional schools, but we sure could devote a lot more of our teaching and scholarship to the institutional reforms that will make virtue more than its own reward. So, for example, we could focus greater attention on strategies for creating ethical infrastructures in corporate and legal organizations, frameworks that require clear standards of accountability, opportunities and obligations concerning internal whistleblowing, adequate ethics policies, training, and enforcement. It's not enough to do as many businesses have it, just sort of throw a code at the problem. They're useful, but by no means sufficient, and it's widely reputed that Enron had one of the best of these ethics codes. It went on sale on eBay the day after the demise with a little caption read, "Never been used." Legislative mandates and professional rules also need to do a lot more to require structures and faculties of professional schools should be more actively involved in helping them develop those structures. Discussion of ethical issues ought to be integrated into the core curriculum and consistently showcased in academic conferences and publications. Integrity, in short, should be treated not as a kind of pontifical or perfunctory digression from the real subject, but at its core foundation. And it's no small task, and I think what's nice about occasions like this are that they really remind us of the challenges of connecting principles to practice. So thanks for listening to the pontification, and now I'm going to share the moral podium.
Thank you, Deborah, and you're going to take questions and comments, so the floor is open.
Deborah, I wonder if you could comment on on the way sometimes when we structure institutions to reward. You give an example of some. You may give an example of some structures that you think could undermine integrity in ways in which you would change those structures to produce better results ethically.
Well, let me pull from my own field where it's pretty easy. The hourly billing structures and the mandatory minimum hourly billables right now make cheating, padding, endemic, inevitable. It used to be that the standard maximum that it was thought lawyers could reasonably work was 1,600 hours a year, given that about a third of the time they spend in office can't truthfully be billed to client matters. It's, a lot of it's administrative matters, keeping up to speed, et cetera, et cetera. The current mandatory minimum for most firms is around 2,000. For young associates, it's 2,400, and what is not changed are the number of the hours in a day. It's just impossible to bill at those rates and have any kind of a life. And the result is that cheating is endemic. You do any surveys of associates, and they all tell you that. And it's everything from just not doing it to inflating the amount of time, doing things that don't really need to be done, charging the client for everything, including the time that you're in the shower, because after all, if a thought about the case crosses your mind, most firms don't put out clear guidelines about billing practices, what is and what is not, because they don't want to know. Most of them certainly don't make any attempt to monitor it. And we generally assume at the corporate level that you're dealing with sophisticated clients, and if the numbers are too high, somebody's going to write them down. But you've created an endemic culture of cheating, and it's, it becomes very easy for that kind of corrosive attitude to fill over. As people have said, for a lot of lawyers, filling out their weekly timesheet is the most imaginative enterprise in which they engage. So there it is. Yeah, Andy?
Isn't that you're reaching for the big part of the problem? We're talking about the ethics of our leaders now. And we're talking about ethics of leaders where the culture is not to be satisfied with making $200,000 a year if you can make $5, or with $500,000 if you can make $1 million, or with $1 million if you can make $3 million, or with $3 million if you can make 10. And as long as that culture pervades our leadership in society, worrying about billable hours, worrying about working 2,400 hours a year is kind of the details of it. And without changing that culture, whether by an attack of measles morals or by a tax structure or something, it's very difficult.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, crass materialism is at the root of a lot of problems. But I think one of the things that's changed in the law, I mean, presumably, some of those incentives have always been present, but the billable hour rate hasn't been jacked as high as it now is to make, cheating a way of life and essential. I think one of the things that's happened in law, and to some extent in business more generally, is just the degree to which salary has become the way of keeping score, and how much of status is now wound up in a single measure of merit. Some people have said that it was when the American lawyer began publishing lawyers' salaries that a lot of the problems and ranking law firms on profitability per partner, that a lot of the problems got exacerbated, because when you knew not only what the guy next door was making, but of course across the way and what other firms were, it became very easy to take your Tinker Toys with you, threaten to do so. Now you've got websites. There's one called Greedy Associates, and within nanoseconds you can log on and find out what the entering salaries are for any firm in the country. So once that becomes the only pecking order, I think you need to create alternative forms of reinforcement and rewards. And one of the reasons why I've just completed a large study on pro bono and what makes it happen in the world, that's where lawyers give unpaid service to low-income individuals and public interest causes, is you've got to make that, and law firms are starting to compete on that. Now they're beginning to rank firms, at least the largest firms, on their pro bono contributions. You've got to create alternative markets in merit and status. And you've got to make people think that there's something other than that, which is a measure, and something other than the hourly bonus. And, I grant you that I have no easy fix for what's going on in the culture, but I think making people aware of the need for those alternative forms of reinforcement and not setting up a kind of hourly billing system that makes cheating endemic. And a lot of places have tried to deal with that problem more responsibly and curb the worst abuses, which at least sends an appropriate signal out there.
Just to sort of push down this path, first a comment, but then a question. A comment to David is it sounds like Notre Dame has a different standard for hiring their football coaches than Bausch and Lomb did for their CEO. I mean, some remember Notre Dame had an applicant, very successful football coach from Georgia Tech, who had falsified his resume, claiming he'd been a star in football, things like that. When that came to light, he was forced to resign. The question, though, gets to what's the domain, and I think Andy's question pushes in that direction. Is the domain the Adelphias, the WorldComs, the Enrons, where people are unambiguously sort of over the bounds? They're violating the law in various ways, or is it the sort of the Michael Douglas Wall Street, greed is good? Michael Ovitz gets $100 million for bailing out of a failed deal. Jack Welch's extraordinary retirement for being the greatest CEO of the last quarter century. Is that in the domain that ought to be in the domain? Should we be talking about executive pay in the corporate sector, which is inflated dramatically in the last quarter century, where there now are sharp divides between American practice and European and Asian practice, for example, where the sort of the greed is good mentality, that is your point. I mean, it's what's the metric?
Right.
The one figure of merit that people are looking to.
Well, I think you should, and I think that business scholars have now been focusing on figuring out ways to change the bonus structure so it doesn't just reward short-term profits, and to try to deal with that misalignment between individuals' own economic interests and those of the corporation generally. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. It's also the case that a lot of the folks in Enron et al. Took the kind of view of little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and operated therefore with blinders. Willful ignorance is the term of art that psychologists use, and there were plenty of signals that everybody was very intent on ignoring. And part of the reason, for example, that in terms of the lawyers, is you had reward structures in the outside firm. The one firm that handled most of the Enron business, the Texas firm, the managing partners on those accounts, their entire life was wound up in Enron. There were 20 former lawyers from that firm who were in Enron in-house. I mean, the sort of connections, and nobody was kind of monitoring that, and the firm may well get stuck with huge liability because people hadn't built an infrastructure within the firm that said, we need to do some things. And there were obvious signals. The firm was asked to do a response to one of the whistleblowing reports where it was passing on transactions that it had signed off on. It's kind of, hornbook lesson of ethics that you can't provide a disinterested judgment, and even if Enron was willing to take it, the firm should never have done it. It was a clear conflict of interest. So, if the firm had better ethics compliance officers paying attention to these sorts of issues, you could have dealt with some of the ways in which the misalignment of individual incentives and social policy played out.
I just wanted, if I could go back to your statement about my mother didn't prepare me, and talk about the research potential in that. But before I begin, I have to add one more anecdote, I'm sure apocryphal. But when I was a student here many years ago, the story went around that 2 Harvard Law School students, now we're talking 60s, early 60s, were walking down the stairs of Langdell after they'd had their first lecture on ethics. And one said to the other, "Thank heavens those guys really bought it, because it's going to leave the field open to us to practice law as usual." Now, I'm sure that is apocryphal, but it gets across just one of the points you were trying to make about how much can you teach in a class. But I was very curious, and my mother didn't prepare me, what the opportunity is for research there. If you look at kind of basic sociological theory, where there is a scaling of underlying values, opinions, behavior, that it seems to me that traditionally one thinks that there are a set of underlying values that prepare people to deal with issues no matter how obscure and how complicated they become. And I thought you were saying, when this man was talking about leverage buyouts, et cetera, that maybe they don't hold up anymore. And I was wondering if there's a chance to do some research on that, to find out if there are underlying values which persist in people's lives, or are they all amenable to what happens with the kinds of challenges they face in their careers?
Well, I've looked a lot at the literature on the situational aspects of ethical behavior, and to just give you a kind of Reader's Digest condensed version of of my reading. You know, what it shows is that people vary in their dispositions, predispositions. Some people come, and it begins in childhood, and it's reinforced through a variety of cultural processes in churches and schools and so forth. So some people are more susceptible to temptation than others. But that if you create the right or the wrong institutional structures, you're going to see a huge amount of convergence. Somebody did a great study of the ethical values of those in Chicago's leading seminary and in the local penitentiary, and found that it was exactly the same set of values. They just had differed in the organizational climate in which they found themselves. So, you know, and the other favorite anecdote is even students, seminary students, on the way back from a lecture on Good Samaritanism are going to pass by the person who seems to be dying on the street if they're in a hurry for their next appointment. So a lot more depends on, you know, the time pressure than on, you know, sort of those values. So I guess that leads me to say, sure, you know, you can't create what isn't there or deal with the fundamental sets of values that people have once you get postgraduate education, but you can do a lot about the situational influences, and we need to pay more attention to those. Dennis, you were going to...
I, as you know, think your emphasis on structural conditions, both in education and reform, is exactly right, and it's very helpful to hear you explain that more today. I want to push a little bit, see if I understood. You began with the concept of integrity, and while you didn't come out against integrity, it did seem that you were saying that's not sufficient. Let me ask if you would take the further step and say, not that it's a bad thing, but that certain concepts like integrity, trust, character, so that are familiar with individual ethics, can actually get in the way of and become obstacles to the kind of structural reform that would be better. Let me give an example, picking up on your Enron comment. I was struck, maybe some of the rest of you were, by the reaction to Enron, WorldCom, the Catholic Church, in a slightly different way, the FBI. If you collect the quotes, we must restore trust. In fact, that was the name of the Catholic bishop's statement. Alan Greenspan, we've got to restore trust in the market, restore trust in the accounting profession. Mueller said, restore trust in the FBI. I would suggest, picking up on your comment about the monitoring, what we need to do is restore distrust. That there is a division of labor, the failure of the gatekeepers in Enron, the accountants, the lawyers, the Wall Street analysts, people who, as you said, put on blinders. They trusted too much. They relied on the integrity of their co-workers. There wasn't enough old-fashioned, at a distance, distrust. And the more you talk about personal integrity, character, and trusting one another, the less you'll pay attention to the structural changes that you need to make in the ethics of oversight, I suggest. Would you accept that, or how far do you want to go in stamping out all these concepts of personal ethics that we learned that our mothers need?
Well, you know, I don't want to stamp them out. I want to, you know, reinforce them wherever I can, but I love your line about restoring distrust. And I think that's really what we need to put much more attention on. And I think that sort of too easy reference to, you know, we need people of integrity in these positions is begs the relevant questions. I was reminded, as you said that, I got one of those great boondoggles, the Leisure of the Theory class. Come to Kauai and talk about Enron and ethics for, you know, all vacation free and one panel for the full conference there. So they got a very good panel, needless to say, not just maybe, but sort of real leaders in the field. Everybody who was invited came for this one, and we also had a bunch of other highly distinguished government servants who I think I won't disclose. But in any event, what was interesting is I delivered a small version of this. One of the people on the panel delivered a much longer version, sort of a preeminent scholar, David Luban, who's a moral philosopher and teaches ethics. And the last person on the panel was a CEO, the local head of something or other, who obviously was there during the conversation because he seemed to be awake. He was on the stage sitting there. He'd obviously had a minion prepare his little talk and hadn't perhaps given it a close look. And within a minute and a half, the answer to our problems is character. If you hire the right people, having just listened to a half an hour of how, that's under the right circumstances or wrong circumstances, the right character doesn't help. And it was as if the whole preceding event hadn't occurred. So I think we just need remedial education at every conceivable level. And there are just so many people who believe that. I'll share with you one wonderful email. I am currently enmeshed, as Barbara knows, in trying to set up an ethics center at Stanford that will be, if not a pale imitation of the one that Dennis has so ably run here, a sort of modest version of trying to bring together people across all of the professional schools and the undergraduate curriculum who share these sorts of interests to do much more interdisciplinary teaching and research and sponsor events and so forth. So one of the things that I had to do was get all the deans on board to kick in funding for this, and to do that I had to convince the deans that there was enough interest as well as need in their school. So the engineering school dean, who was a quantitative kind of guy, said, well, of course I'm for ethics, but I'm not sure anybody else in the faculty cares about it. And I said, well, how about this? How about we do a survey and see whether there are some people. They've got, after all, 250 people who teach in the engineering school in one course on engineering ethics, which I thought, if that didn't shock the conscience of the dean, at least there would be some people who, if I constructed the survey appropriately and said, would you be interested in, if somebody else were to A, provide it for you, B, bribe you to do it, C, invite some fancy people to come in, there would be enough yeses in response to that question that we would get some money out of the engineering school dean, which I'm delighted to say there were, and we did. But one of the emails that came back to him was, I'm going through my unanswered email and came across the survey on the proposed ethics center. My opinion is this is a misuse of our valuable resources. People should know the difference between right and wrong. In borderline cases, just ask. Well, there you are. So, I'm hoping this guy's going to show up at one such event.
He'll ask you.
And in fact, I was asked at one lecture, I remember, some years back, Professor Rhode, what is your theory of right and wrong? That took me aback. I'm not going to share with you my profound response. Yeah, Barbara?
I just want to pick up on what you said, Dennis. I think it might be interesting, Deborah, as you pursue this work, to pick up on the political analog to your comments. In other words, political theory, the Constitution, the whole notion of checks and balances is based on a distrust, as it were, on the nature of man, the nature of humankind. That is, we can teach each other about ethics from now till doomsday, and we're still going to fall back onto our essential natures. And most political structures are based on that distrust, that you can't rely on us to behave ourselves, and so that's what the law and in particular political theorists build the ideas of governance around. And I think it's actually a fairly interesting parallel.
Well, I think that's right. In thinking about the whole issue of ethical infrastructures, David Wilkins, who's here at the law school, has done a lot of work on this, and it really brings me back to my political theory undergraduate years of checks and balances,
Exactly.
and that's what are missing in many places. And lawyers who are so good about seeing conflicts of interest everywhere else when it's their own profession and their own internal law firm structure are really extraordinarily oblivious to it. And so I think we could learn a lot from that.
But sometimes precisely in government, but also in these other things, structuring for heavy accountability, structuring for checks and balances precisely drives out integrity. Right. That is to say, people who can't stand that sort of thing, and I am one of them, I think, don't go where there's massive amounts of accountability and paperwork, where there are so many checks and balances that you can't get things done.
Right.
We prefer places in which the people of integrity are chosen and given a larger scope. So you have to put that into your calculus.
Well, sure, and what you're looking for is to try to create an organizational culture that sustains it, however that can be done. And if it can be done through the informal norms, much better than through the external checks. I mean, we all know that, and we've all been in those situations where, if it takes you 29 forms to get your expenses reimbursed, at some point, you give up. But many people then find ways to cheat in other forms because, you created a structure that strikes people as unfair. So you want to create it. And every institution is different. I mean, I think that there's no kind of bright line rules that are going to, and little law firms have different sets of problems than big law firms do, but that's part of what you need to factor in a sophisticated sort of way. Yeah.
Deborah, I had a question about what we observe versus what we know through research. It's been relatively clear to me in politics that the character of the person at the top of an organization or in charge of an organization does send a signal to everyone else in the organization, and people take their cues from that and act accordingly. And I would argue that the same might have been said of a variety of corporate scandals, that has Kozlowski or Ken Lay been replaced by Bill George, for example, as CEO of each of those companies, I would imagine the outcome would have been quite different. But I'm curious to what extent that's borne out by research, if there is research on the quality of the leader and how it affects the organization.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of information about when you ask people to rank what's most important. What they think to be the moral values of the leadership is key, and they have to vet
their actual behavior down the line.
Well, it's people's perceptions of the values of the leader, and does that person live up to them? So that makes a huge difference. So, it's not a straight line correlation in the sense that, that there may be some distortions of image, but most workers have a pretty clear idea about, what the values are of leadership, but they measure it, in terms not just of what's in the code or what's said on ceremonial occasions, but what's modeled in the practices of the organization.
I'm asking that additional question. Is there any evidence that some organizations, as a result of people within organizations, behave differently than from people in organizations?
Absolutely. Companies differ a lot in terms of that, and there are some exemplary companies that do well, which is one thing. That just like there's some exemplary law firms that do huge amounts of pro bono and they're highly profitable. So I think you can make some differences, and usually it's and the moral leadership that comes from the top is really quite critical. If you ask, here's just another illustration. If you ask why do certain law firms with the same kind of profits per partner do a lot of public interest work and other law firms do none, virtually, or very little, a lot of it has to do with the values of the firm's founders or who was on the management committee. And over time that becomes kind of self-perpetuating, because if you want to do that pro bono work, you got to go to a firm that gives you credit against billable hours. So whether the firm does that or not, really, that's the institutional structure, but whether it's got that institutional structure is reflective of the values of the leadership. So that's just one illustration of it. I'm sorry, Susan, you've been.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted, given that you cited the Milgram experiments, I wanted to ask you about a kind of massive lapse of integrity that actually you and I both know about from being at Stanford, although I was there and I'm not sure whether you were there. But this was an occasion that was like the Milgram experiments in that you would have expected better of the people involved. It was sort of like them in that it required a little bit of standing up on the part of people rather than simply refraining from doing harm. And it was different from them in that it was rather public. And this was the occasion on which I stood up in the Stanford Faculty Senate and I read out from a letter. I was challenging Condoleezza Rice on her sort of drawing back from Stanford's affirmative action policy. And I read out from a letter she'd written. And she stood there in front of the entire Faculty Senate and the visitors and denied that she had said that. And I had the letter in my hand. I was quoting from it. And she yelled at me and, you know, carried on that those were not her words. And everybody sat on their hands. Nobody said, let's see the letter, let's find out what the story is about this. Everybody just sat there quietly. And I saw that as an incredible lapse of people's integrity. Then they were not willing to even find out whether their provost was blatantly lying. And I wonder what explains that kind of thing. Is it a kind of passive brown-nosing? Or is it a kind of fear of retaliation, which, as we've seen in the last few weeks, is maybe not unwarranted. But what are people thinking when they just sit there on a time like that?
Well, I was at that meeting, so let me tell you what I was thinking, being, you know, a supporter.
Well, you certainly stood up against her on all kinds of occasions.
Well, you know, so my sense is it's a time, place, and manner. I mean, there wasn't really an opportunity at that meeting, given her control and her, you know, sort of off-the-charts reaction to that letter, to do much at that meeting. I mean, I think a lot of people, we were stunned that she would do that publicly, and didn't feel that that was a moment in which we could be recognized and be heard. I mean, we just seen what she, you know, it was sort of like after the bomb comes down on Hiroshima, you know, it was like, you know, we were standing there. Do you want to have another one?
Did she say anything about weapons of mass destruction?
But I will tell you that I had a conversation later with her because I was on a panel to talk about problems at Stanford in faculty hiring, and I was on a panel. I was recruited to talk about the general problem of the representation of women in academia, and also on the panel, this was sponsored by the Institute for Research on Women and Gender that I used to head, were some people who were then suing Stanford. You know, it was a kind of, I said nothing about Stanford's situation. I just talked about, in general, what the university policies. Connie called me in about a week after that event and took me to task, would be a slight understatement, for appearing on this panel that would seem to give legitimacy to these women. And as I sat there in the provost's office and listened to this, I thought, this is what tenure is for. And, you know, I said, you know, I think you and I have a slight disagreement about academic freedom. That centered ballistic as well. So I think that there were people who did kind of grit our teeth and do it, even when we thought that there were going to be some personal costs connected to it. But I don't think so. So in defense of my colleagues, but I also think that there are a lot of people who think, gee, I don't have a dog in this fight. Let the women do it on some other occasion.
One of the gatekeepers, and you're a student in professions and professional schools, are professional schools. And so, and again, to caveat, I'm a relative newcomer to the business school without tenure, so. But just reflecting on my observations, since I came here a little over a year ago, to watch the reaction of one of the gatekeepers, and so it's interesting to look around at what we call professional schools, and there are different sort of levels of professions. And I find business as a professional school and business as a profession an interesting topic for research. But my question was to watch the school's reaction as a gatekeeper, as a bystander, to what was going on with their graduates. And I sort of broke it down into 4 questions that I thought that we had an opportunity to have an institutional conversation at the business school. When something like this happens, you have small windows of opportunity, as you started your talk this afternoon, to have a discussion about these issues. And I felt that we skipped the first 3 and went to the 4th one immediately. And so I would ask you, to preface this all, I'll give you the 4 questions, but I ask you to think about this. How optimistic are you that we can make institutional reform, say, at professional schools, in particular business schools, given they're different than the other professions? And here are the 4 questions that I thought we missed an opportunity to have an institutional level discussion of. First one is, should we?
Should we what?
Should we even address this? Is it our role as faculty in the professional school, in this case the business school, even go here? And some of the responses, and there's a wide range of responses among the faculty along each 4 of these questions. So on the one end of this is, well, absolutely. In the history of the professions, this is what the school was founded. And I have a colleague who's doing the research and shows this what it's all about. On the other end, it's like, that's not what the students pay for. They're not going to come here. That's not really, So first one is, should we? The second one is, which you touched on, is can we? It's the mother's knee thing, and by the time we get them, and there's nothing we can do anyway. And the third one is, even if you get past the first 2, yes, this is important, that we should, for the school is an important role. And we can actually have an impact. Given this is an elite school, people will look at, and people are in ways unusually open to being influenced when they're getting MBAs, at least at Harvard, given the institutional sort of legitimacy and the fact that they've sort of cut ties to, they're in a period of transition. The third one is, so if so, what? If then what? Which begs the question of sort of, what do we have a set of institutional values or even professional values that a faculty, let alone the profession, could reach some consensus on that we collectively agree on and want to sort of. And then the final one is, given all those things, okay, then how would we do that given we have them for 2 years or something? And it seems that even though there's not, I don't sense any agreement on the first 3 questions, whether or not it's even our role, whether or not we can have an impact, and whether or not we could ever agree on some collective set of values or norms, professional norms. We just kind of, those are tough. Those are 2 tough conversations to have. We went to the 4th one and we threw a course at it. Not to say that's not a great start, and not to say that the senior leaders of the business school are savvy enough to realize that the first 3 questions would take us forever and we wouldn't get anything done if we started. But how optimistic are you, again, given those 4 questions, that business schools in particular have an opportunity as a gatekeeper to have an impact on what is arguably not really a profession, because you don't need an MBA to practice. There are no professional institutes. There's no gate. You don't have to go through the bar. There's a lot of things that are different than the other professions.
Well, I'll give you a somewhat different answer now than I would have given you in my younger, more radical days when I was very cynical about incremental reform and throwing one course at it and the whole response, from the...
You recognize me.
Now I think every little bit helps. So if you get, people focusing on how to do it better from little seeds grow. One of the good things that happened as a result of the highly cosmetic responses, most schools in the post-Watergate era, I think Andy would agree with me, sort of spinelessly instituted a requirement, recruited outsiders, not serious scholars, to teach it. It was viewed as, Gary Trudeau once called it in a cartoon. He was charting the development, trendy lip service to our better selves, as a student sort of having to take it, and somebody had to teach it, and if you could get a retired judge. I never took a course when I was in law school, and what passed for courses elsewhere, as I learned, was retired judges who got up there with their slide projector and said, today we will learn about 3 conflicts of interest. Tomorrow it will be 3 rationales for zealous advocacy. He went through and, 3. So, but what happened is the subject was important and intrinsically interesting, and folks like Andy, who published one of the first case books, got interested. I saw it as sort of a starter discipline, and although it wasn't valued at my school, it was a little bit like, Brer Rabbit. Oh, you want to teach ethics? Great, So it's gradually acquired a fair amount of intellectual respectability. It's taken a couple of decades, but now there's serious scholars involved in it, and it's not just a Mickey Mouse course at many institutions. One would, I don't want to overclaim, but there's a lot of serious and good work going on. And, that's not true in law schools elsewhere around the globe. I mean, we're really sooner than others, and part of it's been a growth pattern, and I think business schools, frankly, are lagging a bit behind, and there isn't as well developed a field of business ethics scholarship as there needs to be for it to get the kind of critical attention. And if events like this push it a little higher up on the resource priorities list for whatever reason, I think that's a good thing. And sooner or later, if you build it, they will come.
Especially if they have to.
I resisted for many years teaching it as a required course at Stanford for exactly that reason, and so we got to do it pervasively. I published a book on the pervasive method. I made it easy for my colleagues to do it with little modules. We bribed, we tried all of the above, and then we did a student survey and a faculty survey. Asked the faculty members, how often did you include issues? Asked the students the same question. And I said, I agree not to publish the results of this if we get more serious. So now we have a menu of courses. They have to take one, but they don't all have to take, the same one. So it's slightly better, and I think you've got to move in that direction in business schools. Give them a range of ways to satisfy the requirement and try to make the requirements well-designed courses. There are people who know how to do it pretty well, and God knows Harvard, with all of its resources, ought to be able to hire a few or grow its own.
It is required in the business school. In fact, interestingly, almost every one of the professional schools here now requires it, except the divinity school.
Well, they're so pure.
There it is, the pervasive method, right? They cope with their ethics.
Can I ask if there's been any look at some of the military academies or the military school?
That's a good question.
He knows.
Scott?
Yeah, that was my job before I came here. Was to sort of run the leader development program in the military academies. And back to to frame it in the 4 questions I gave you, I realized how difficult it was, given that the first 3 questions I mentioned, should we, can we, and if so, what are the values, were already answered at the military academy. So we had them younger. We attract, select certain people. We're very clear about our values. We know what the values are. We state them. We're here about, and we say the school is all about that. So we're attracting, selecting certain people. And so, I mean, under what I would think, the most ideal of conditions, on the first 3 questions, yes, we absolutely should. It's our mission. It's what the country expects us. Can we do it? Well, it doesn't matter, because this is our, and we really take it seriously, and it's through the whole experience. And the third one is, what are the values? Well, we got them, duty, honor, country, and the 7 Army values. So there's no disagreement about any of that. So we've spent 200 years focusing on the 4th question, which is, so given that we agree on all that, how do you do it? And so, and this is, not a short answer, but even with a 47-month total institution-like experience, with younger kids who were ideally attracted, selected, and we control the organization's culture that they graduate into. We still have, 3-4-star generals who are wearing ribbons that they didn't earn, and then we have, we have some senior leaders that make it all the way through that do things we're not proud of. But yeah, I've got lots of insights on, on what we've learned on doing that. But back to my question about optimism.
I don't know that everybody here knows, Scott, that you were at West Point your whole career until you got here.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know the literature on this. I know, for example, I've done a little bit of work about what went wrong at the Air Force Academy on the gender questions for obvious reasons. So, duty, honor, country, I guess, treating women like, where no means no was not one of the received values at that particular institution, at least in practice. If
so my passion, just to finalize of my military career, and ended up at the last half at the military academy at West Point, was to, and this is the question, and this is my response. I'm probably going to be on a panel of advisors for the Air Force Academy on moving forward. Was the basic value of respect, and this has been my lifelong goal in uniform. Was we still have something at West Point that and I'm not proud of, and I spent the last 20 years trying to change, which is this sort of sophomoric behavior that's so deeply rooted in what we call sort of hazing the fourth class.
Right.
I mean, if you have and this is my answer to the senior leaders of the Air Force Academy. There's a lot more to it about how women were treated, but talk about mixed signals from the institution. If you actually condone that it's okay to treat a quarter of your students, freshmen, like they're less than human with this, I mean, and we condone that for years at the service academies, that you can treat them with this sort of sophomoric behavior, this playing games with them. Why should we be surprised that young adolescents are confused when, okay, it's okay to treat a quarter of our students like that? Well, they happen to be freshmen. Okay, well, they happen to be women, or these happen to be African Americans, or and so you send real strong mixed signals. Anyway, that's a short answer to that, and we have a long way to go. So.
Yeah.
But that shows how hard it is to change that. I mean, that's General MacArthur, superintendent of the military academy, declared one day, no more hazing. Well, that was a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think there probably that's a literature I ought to look at. I mean, in some ways, the military has done much better. So, for example, race relations, in terms of integrating under challenging circumstances, it's done far better than most private institutions. So let's give some credit, and under very difficult circumstances, less good. Obviously, are still ways to go on women's issues.
We have very significant variation across the services.
Yeah.
The Army's done far better than the Navy.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, the other great issue that still remains to be done, one of my colleagues has, and I was reading it on the plane coming out, is the don't ask, don't tell policy. And what a scandal the enforcement of that policy has turned out to be. So that's where you want to know the quarter that's still, and now we tell them we don't even want you to be able to come out and tell us about this. So talk about suppressing
institutional ambivalence. But what a policy!
Right. Yeah.
I'd like to enforce it if you were a leader. Right?
Yeah. Well, that's what it is. Maybe one more question.
She had a question. Hannah? Yeah, I could to your every little bit counts point, and also this notion of, I forget the word you used, of diffusion or something like that. What advice do you have for someone who's not a trained ethicist or philosopher about how to get not get students on the same page in terms of what their values should be? Because I think that in the military institution, that's the difference with a business school or a public policy school. I don't think we can dictate that. But I think what I heard you saying, and what I've read what I've read elsewhere, is that it's not informing people what the value should be, but trying to get them thinking critically and trained thinking critically, so that when they're faced with some sort of ethical situation, that they have those skills. And I've tried to get my students to write a paper on what is moral leadership, which the point of which is for them to push on it, have it squish and slip away, and have some readings on moral relativism and some other Hannah Arendt's and totalitarian. I mean, a variety of different things, but I'm not sure I'm doing this the best way. And I don't know, what resources would you suggest for somebody like me who's just kind of trying but wouldn't be fielding a course anytime soon?
Well, that's why I want an ethics center at Stanford, because there's a lot of people in your situation who we need to have a longer conversation, is what I think I need to tell you, but who are not specialists in the subject, but would like to do some of it and do it better, and need some help from the people who do it. And I give you some suggestions and people to pull together, but that's exactly what I'm going to be doing for our business school, is to try to develop some model modules. And the notion is not that you're going to get people on the same page with what the answers are. And I always tell my students in the last lecture and the course, that in some ways, it's a unique course in which you hope, if you've done it well, that the students leave with more questions than they came in with, which is not what they're looking for elsewhere in their ethics education. But I think it's the people who go through life sort of oblivious to those questions that are the ones who are going to be the most likely to be the sources of problems. I want to give people the sort of techniques to think critically about them, and not expect that they or I are always going to share the view about what the right response is. And I part company with the bar's own ethics codes on a lot of relevant points. I hope my students at the close of the course do too. But I want them to learn both, what the rules are, what the limits of those rules are, how inadequate they are to cope with certain situations, and what are the strategies that they should use. To give you just one example on the moral leadership, I mean, I think giving the students some ways to think about creating structures that will reinforce moral leadership is important. I think it's also important to teach people about the values of finding support. One of the interesting things that comes out of the Milgram experiment, for example, is that if you put people in the same experimental situation and put them with somebody else who was also willing to resist, goes back to students' point, gave them, in other words, a friend, the number of people who would refuse to do it shoots way up. So if you can get just one more person in the group, same thing if you ask a group to say, how long is this line? And you can get incredible distortions in people's perceptions if everybody in the group says it's that long. But if one other person is willing to say what you think, that makes a big difference. Telling people about strategies for coping in their own workplace, so that when they confront something like this, they need to find somebody who is in a position of leadership that they can go to and get some support from. Sort of an obvious point, but you can drive it home with illustrations of what happens when those people are not present in the workplace versus situations where they are. So that's the kind of thing that I think you can give people some more tools for.
Just to follow up on that, it's really nice. I mean, we talk a lot about building your network for all sorts of instrumental purposes or social support purposes, but it'd be a really interesting idea to sort of add that into the discussion of, okay, also when you're thinking about your network and trying to advance something, how might it change group dynamic on an ethical issue if you could actually get more than one voice? Yeah, that's
right.
Really neat.
And the need to create people who are not just going to be the friend. I mean, there's some evidence that people go to somebody who is likely to give them the answer that they want under some of these circumstances. So anointing an ethics compliance officer who's not necessarily their friend, but that's going to take the long view of the organization's interest, turns out to be helpful. So it's a bit beyond just the sheer networking. It's again about institutional design. But I'm glad you raised it, because there's obviously a need for it. And
well, Deborah, it's 1:30, and you might want to, I don't know if you want to say a word, but you had told me before that you're thinking of your next book, which might be called, in fact, Moral Leadership. So I don't know if you want to say another word about that now, but it's so obvious there's a need, the twinning of the ethics and leadership. But there's a bunch of us here who would buy it, use it, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, although we should probably defer to Jeff, given his publishing background. I wonder if anything with that title wouldn't be a complete turnoff. It's a swamp of, and professionalism used to be the mantra in my own line of work. That was, we had a whole cottage industry of professionalism, and after a while, some of us just signed a professionalism non-proliferation treatment because the term was so devalued. And I don't know, NPR just ran a thing on moral leadership. I was telling Barbara a little talk show, and they had a couple of CEOs who've just penned best-selling novels, or not novels.
That word.
Well, that's highly Freudian. In which they said character is all, and moral leadership has to come from the top, and it was such pablum. So I think there's a real need for some more serious scholarship on the issues, and I welcome today to get thoughts about your thoughts.
Thank you, Deborah. There's also a need for more Rhode at Harvard, particularly at the Kennedy School, at WAP, and at the Center for Public Leadership. Thank you very much.